I would like to introduce our next speaker, the director of the American Museum of Science and Energy, Alan Lowe.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to join you here today. I want to thank Warren and his team for putting together a great conference on an important topic and for what you do every day to preserve and make our history available in this community. The American Museum of Science and Energy Foundation is happy to, in a small way, help with this conference as a sponsor. And I got to note, it's really good to be here with some great friends and colleagues from the past. Alan Packwood and Mike Fitzgerald and Lillian Mashburn, Ambassador Ash is here. I know Sherry Lee and Deb and Mark Brzezina, who aren't here, but in 2006, I was director of the then Howard Baker Center, now the Howard Baker School at UT, and we put together a conference on the Anglo-American Alliance that is still one of the high points in my professional life, what we did. Sadly, I missed the follow-up conference a few years later in Cambridge, Alan, but I was already gone to Texas by then, but that was just a terrific experience, and it's an important topic we're talking about here today. So thank you for making us part of it. Now let's see if this works. I joke, ladies and gentlemen, that I oversee 2 science museums, but technology typically does not like me. So let's see if this works. It worked, yes. So I will say originally, until just this morning, to be honest, I had a speech ready to go for all of you about East Tennessee during the war, everything absent the Manhattan Project, which Ray Smith, our next speaker, is going to cover. But I realized that Jack Neely was starting the proceedings, and like Ray and the Manhattan Project, I cannot compete with Jack Neely when it comes to Knoxville. And more than a few of my examples about East Tennessee and the war had to do, obviously, with Knoxville. And he told an amazing story. I just wrote down notes here. Everything from depth charges and plexiglass to SART and deep throat. My God. I told Warren it was the Forrest Gump.
Keep talking.
The Forrest Gump of World War II right here. And
I can't find it.
You can't find all that. That's okay. That's all right. Thank you, Ray, for trying. I appreciate it. Yes, Ken Mays comes to the rescue.
We're going to get through this.
I have faith. And usually when I try to get rid of something like this, I destroy the computer. Look at that. Great job, yes. It's dismissed forever. So I thought instead I would prepare for Ray's presentation about the Manhattan Project by reversing the time flow a bit and showing just briefly, just for a few minutes, how since World War II this region has been transformed by the experience of that war as kind of an example of the long-lasting impact of that conflict here, as you see so many places around the nation and the world. Now, yes. So before World War II, as you'll hear from Ray, as you heard from Jack, the area now known as Oak Ridge was farmed by a good number of families, but it was not a city by any means. There were small rural communities there, like Wheat and Elza. It was a beautiful place in our state that you would have thought might stay that way forever. But by the end of the war, as Jack noted, some 75,000 people were there producing enriched uranium for the atomic bomb. This all happened in just a matter of about 3 years. There you see the K-25 plant, the Calutron, and some of the residents there celebrating the end of the war. But what's happened since then? It was very possible that all the know-how and the equipment and the men and women who gathered here during the war could have been moved elsewhere. And there certainly were discussions about moving those functions elsewhere in the nation after the war. But thankfully, that did not happen, and wiser minds and leaders here and in Washington prevailed. So the result was that the missions and the structures, and in some cases the men and women who were here processing uranium, and to a smaller extent plutonium during the war, those transformed in the post-war era into what are known today as the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and the Y-12 National Security Complex. But also post-war, we realized the extent of the cleanup needed to remove potentially harmful materials from buildings and the soil in the complex. So that's where the Department of Energy's Environmental Management Office has come in as a world leader in environmental remediation, making sites like the old location of the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant in Oak Ridge, kind of an exemplar of how to clean up a site the right way. So in Oak Ridge, environmental management, or EM, we love acronyms, so just get ready. EM works hand in hand with United Cleanup Oak Ridge, or UCOR, and they do really incredible work that, again, is kind of an example for the world of how to do that type of cleanup. So EM is an important part of it. With Oak Ridge National Laboratory, the child of what was called X-10 during the war, Tennessee has the nation's largest multi-purpose laboratory, operated by the Department of Energy in a partnership with UT Battelle. The lab, or ORNL, is a leader and innovator in so many areas. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, as a student of history, I've had to learn a lot of science and engineering in my 5 years as director here. So I've learned about things they lead in, like nanotechnology, like additive manufacturing, supercomputing, neutron science, fission and fusion energy, all these things and so many more I'm leaving out. The production of radioisotopes alone would be the subject of many conferences and books. They had that idea during the Manhattan Project with the historic graphite reactor that they built in Oak Ridge, and afterwards that reactor and then successors to that reactor have created radioisotopes used in medicine, industry, agriculture, research. That alone, again, could be the subject of many of these conferences. So an amazing legacy left here by the war, grown after the war at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And there you see a picture of part of that campus. The Y-12 National Security Complex, or Y-12, grew out of the site where the calutrons separated uranium-235 during the war via electromagnetic separation. Not to get into everything Ray Smith is going to talk about, but there were a few ways of pulling out that uranium-235, the much more fissile type of uranium, from U-238. And this was one of those areas where they used electromagnetic separation. Today, Y-12 is operated by the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA, in partnership with Combined Nuclear Services, or CNS. Y-12 has been and remains central to the nation's security, and so much happens just right up the road. They do that through a constant maintenance of our nation's nuclear stockpile, by working around the world to help ensure nuclear nonproliferation and to enable the peaceful uses of things like radioisotopes, and to provide the uranium that is used in the nuclear fuel for our nuclear navy. All of our aircraft carriers and subs are now nuclear powered. So Y-12 has an essential role in that. When you look at ORNL and Y-12 and environmental management and the DOE's Office of Science, they've not only accomplished those tasks that have grown out of the war, they've inspired the creation or location of thousands of new businesses here in East Tennessee that really make this a focus of innovation in the nation. In the ongoing nuclear renaissance, which is happening right around us right now, over 100 companies now are in East Tennessee working to advance fission and fusion energy for the future. When you add in the connections with UT and other academic institutions, the partnerships they have with K-12 schools and amazing museums like ours, and the economic impact on our cities and counties, you see the transformative effect of these massive organizations that really had their genesis during the Manhattan Project right here in East Tennessee. So we help tell these stories every day at the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K-25 Atomic History Center in Oak Ridge. They give us an unparalleled, I think, platform to teach lessons of STEAM, science, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics, to people of all ages. But none of that would have happened. None of it would have happened if Leslie Groves had chosen some other location in the United States for processing uranium. And none of it also would have happened if good people here had not lobbied to keep and expand those functions post-war, and if great partnerships like the one between UT and the lab had not been created over time. All these things came together to be transformative. For us then, the war was revolutionary. The work they did here in so many ways helped create the Tennessee we know today, but I know we're not alone in that respect. We live in a world, in part at least, in large part, created by the Second World War. I think its ramifications continue not just to ripple, but to crash over our political and economic, our cultural, our social landscapes, and I'll add our individual landscapes, if that's a phrase. I think many of us have that family history in the war as well. I had a father who took part in the occupation of Japan, a stepfather and a grandfather who fought in the South Pacific, two uncles who fought in Europe, and a great-uncle killed in the Battle of Okinawa. These are stories I grew up with. It was part of our daily lives that we talked about this. You know, President Roosevelt said, "Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced." In an era of total war, conflicts are won on the factory floor and on the battlefield. During the Second World War, we know that 16 million Americans went to war overseas, and 24 million entered war industries here on the home front. The level of effort required by all the Allies, truly hard to grasp, and seen here in microcosm in East Tennessee. As you heard from Jack, Knoxville was front and center in many of those efforts. Other places, too, down in Chattanooga, they had the Volunteer Army Ammunition Plant with over 400 buildings dedicated to producing and storing TNT. Up in Kingsport, Tennessee Eastman oversaw the world's largest producer of high explosives, Holston Ordnance, all supporting this Allied effort and those Tennesseans fighting overseas. If I have my numbers correct, I think around 300,000 Tennesseans fought. 5,731 of them would give their lives for all of us. Now, I invite you all to come up to Oak Ridge. I know Ray Smith is going to tell you so much more and so much more interesting information than me, but I want you to come up to Oak Ridge, experience our community, visit our museums, the American Museum of Science and Energy and the K-25 Atomic History Center. Here you see some photos of those. The young lady with the hair standing up, that's something called the Van de Graaff generator at AMSI. It's been there almost since the beginning. I go anywhere in the country and say I'm director of AMSI, they'll say, "Oh, I've been there and I had my hair stood up." That's the bottom line. I was in this tiny shop in the middle of Illinois, and I said I was visiting from Oak Ridge. Someone said, "Oh, I've been to Oak Ridge. I went to this museum and I got my hair stood up." I said, "I'm the director there. That's our museum." So please come up and do that. We have many other things. If you come up there, you'll see this history. You'll see the science that came out of it. You can also go to great places like the Children's Museum of Oak Ridge, the Oak Ridge History Museum, the Scarborough Community Center, the Manhattan Project National Historical Park. And I should note also that we manage for the Department of Energy their public facilities bus tours, usually March through November, that time frame, 3 days a week, and you get to go to the K-25 Atomic History Center. In a normal year, you get to go to the historic graphite reactor at Oak Ridge National Lab, and then to the Y-12 Visitor Center. So you can all check out all that on our handy-dandy website, amsi.org, k25historycenter.org, and listen to our podcast, AMSIcast. One of the wonderful guests on that podcast is Alan Packwood, who's talked to me about Churchill and science. It's been a little while ago now, but yeah, we have about 80 episodes on there, many topics relevant to our topic here today. So with that, thank you for having me. I'm going to turn the microphone over to AMSI Foundation board member and the historian of Oak Ridge, Ray Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Let me make a couple of adjustments to this, and we will get another program up. I'm almost sure I can do that. Well, we made it that far, didn't we? Very good. Let's see how much further we go. We have a couple of more technical adjustments that I'll make as we're going along, but I'm hoping you're going to get some insights into Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project that maybe you haven't seen or heard of before. However, as I have a presentation, it's going to be Ed Westcott photographs, as you might expect, and it seems a bit formal, but I'll guarantee you, if you will ask me a question, I will go down a rabbit trail I hadn't planned, but it will be a better presentation for all of us. So don't hesitate to interrupt me. Now, let me introduce this topic by picking up on something that Jack Neely said about TVA being here and all of the reasons. I mean, think about it. Was it 4 or 5 or even more dams that were built? Much of that to supply electricity to Oak Ridge. Is that some of the reasons that this place was chosen? He talked about a rural area, and you hear him talk about inland from the sea, those kinds of things. Let me tell you what may be closer to the truth. Albert Einstein signed a letter that Leo Szilard wrote to President Roosevelt saying that Germany's buying up all this uranium ore and they were afraid they were trying to build a bomb out of it. Leo Szilard knew that President Roosevelt wouldn't know who he was, but he would know Albert Einstein, so he got him to sign the letter. I learned just a few weeks ago from General Grove's grandson that President Roosevelt never read the letter. They gave it to Alexander Sachs, and Alexander Sachs was a close friend of President Roosevelt. He wrote a one-paragraph executive summary and put it on top of the letter. When he gave it to the president read the paragraph and said, "What you're telling me is Germany is trying to make a big bomb to drop on us." And he said, "Yes, sir, that's right." He said, "Well, we need to make it first." So he took that and started the Manhattan Project. General Groves was put in charge of it. Groves had just finished building the Pentagon, so he knew how to put a large construction project together. He knew how to get private industry involved, and he knew how to spend money. So President Roosevelt also called in Senator McKellar, and he said, "Senator, I need to put a large amount of money against the war effort, and I can't let the press or anyone know how much it is or what it's being used for. Can you help me with that?" Senator McKellar said, "Yes, Mr. President, I can do that for you. Just where in Tennessee are you going to put that?" That might have more to do with us getting selected here in East Tennessee than any rivers and valleys and ridges and proximity to a dam. Al and I had an opportunity to talk and interview Senator Howard Baker before he passed away. We took a television camera up to his office in Huntsville, Scott County. Now back then, we'd do it on our iPhone today, but back then we had a big camera. We set it up in front of his desk, put him behind his desk, and said, "Okay, Senator, tell us about your connection to Oak Ridge." He said, "First, let me tell you how that place was chosen." And he went into that Senator McKellar story in the most flamboyant way you've ever seen. When he got through, I said, "Thank you, Senator, for putting on video the story that I tell everyone who comes to Oak Ridge." He said, "Where did you get that story?" I said, "I got it from Dick Smizer, longtime editor of the local newspaper there, the Oak Ridge." He said, "That's where I got it too." So that's the story about Senator McKellar. I'm not going to tell you the full story, but I'm going to quickly remind you of one more that I always tell. And I know this one's true because the man that it happened to just passed away within the last year. Lester Fox is his name. And I'll get to mention him again in this presentation. But he was, back then in 1942, he was a sophomore in high school at Oliver Springs. And to make the story short, the principal of the high school got a phone call. Lester had to send him to get the call. He was skipping school, but at any rate he did. And when he got the call, he came back to the school and he called all the students together in an assembly. He said, "I've just gotten a phone call from Senator McKellar. He wants me to tell you to go home and tell your parents you're going to have to find another place to live. The government's going to take your property for the war effort." Now, Lester swears that's the way those 3,000 people first learned they were going to have to get off of nearly 60,000 acres in order to make room for the Manhattan Project. And they did. They got off in a matter of days, some of them, to make that project happen. Now, let's talk a little bit about how Oak Ridge is laid out. If you look at that, you'll see the actual Clinch River runs right along the edge on the east side, along the south side, and on the west side. And then the city of Oak Ridge is up at the top. Y-12 is just across Pine Ridge. Oak Ridge National Laboratory is down in Bethel Valley. And the East Tennessee Technology Park Heritage Center, which was the Y-12 or the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant, and the S-50 thermal diffusion plant are located there. So that kind of gives you a lay of the land for what was taken for the Manhattan Project, the Clinton Engineer Works, Kingston Demolition Range. Isn't that amazing? General Groves didn't like that name, so he made them change it. He said it's too close to what we're doing. Call it the Clinton Engineer Works. So this is the K-25 building in 1945, largest building in the world under one roof at that time, 44 acres. What's left of it today is the footprint. And they're building a viewing platform right down at, we're looking at it in this view from the north looking south. The viewing platform will be down at the south looking north, over on the east wing. And you'll be able to see the footprint of that large building. Now they're going to put up poles at the corners to show you the height of the building. DOE doesn't know this yet. Well, if they know it, they're not saying anything about it. But my goal is to have them put mirrors up on top of those poles, and let's have a laser show at night that will show you the size of the building. So we'll see if we can, Alan, if we can make that work. Has to be cheap. They won't spend much money on it. But the K-25 gaseous diffusion plant was a continuous operation, and it could operate for a tenth of what it cost to run Y-12. Y-12 was a batch process and had 22,482 people working there in August of 1945. By December of 1946, the K-25 process could produce highly enriched uranium weapons grade. And that's where all of the nation's highly enriched uranium that we have today came from, is the K-25 gaseous diffusion process. Operated from 1945, actually March of 45, until 1964. And we still reprocess and reuse the highly enriched uranium produced in this one building over that 20-year period. This is the S-50. This is a plant that most people never know about. It was a thermal diffusion plant. And when they were building the K-25 plant, they needed a source of electricity, and they were afraid they weren't going to get enough from TVA. So they built a power plant. It was actually the world's largest steam power generating plant at the time. And they were trying to get the K-25 gaseous diffusion process barrier material to work, and they were having trouble with it. By the way, that barrier material, in a space the size of my thumbnail, there's 1 million holes, all the same size, equally spaced, and that 235 and 238 gets pumped through as uranium hexafluoride gas, and the 235 goes through just a little easier, a little faster than the 238 because it's 3 neutrons lighter, and it'll go through a little faster. But that's how the K-25 process worked. They couldn't get the barrier working. So Robert Oppenheimer heard about the Navy. Now, Oppenheimer was out at Los Alamos. His brother, Frank Oppenheimer, actually lived in Oak Ridge and worked in Oak Ridge at Y-12. And Robert Oppenheimer visited here. So he knew about Oak Ridge, what was going on. And he was trying to get this uranium out to Los Alamos. And Y-12 was slow as molasses, you might think, because they 1,152 calutrons operating for about 18 months to get enough uranium for Little Boy, less than a gallon, about 60 kilograms, 140 pounds approximately, but a very small amount. That's why Great Britain came to the United States and said, look, we know we can make a bomb out of uranium-235, but getting that material is so difficult. It will require so many resources. We don't have that resource. You do. You make the bomb, and we'll send our scientists over to help. And that's exactly what they did. But Oppenheimer knew that the Navy was experimenting with thermal diffusion. And he told Groves, he said, look, the hard part of getting this uranium-235 separated is getting it from 0.7% up to 1, 2, or 3%. Once you get it up a little bit, it starts getting easier. In 1,000 pounds of uranium ore, there's only 7 pounds of uranium-235. So he said, you can't get that barrier working. You've got the steam. Let's make a thermal diffusion plant. So General Groves went to the contractor and said, I need you to build me a thermal diffusion plant. I need it built right by that steam plant. and I need it in 90 days. The contractor said, that's impossible, it can't be done. Groves looked him in the eye and said, you've got 80 days. They built it in 76 days, operated it for about 3 months, and it's calculated that by getting that little bit of feed material to go into the Y12 beta cations, the second stage, and then into the gaseous diffusion process, which in turn fed material into the electromagnetic process, the cations at Y12. It's calculated that it shortened the war by about 3 weeks. So that's the kind of things. And again, from General Grove's grandson, he told me that his grandfather would only allow himself 1 hour to make the most difficult decision. Think about the kind of decisions General Groves was making, one right after the other, whether to have a gaseous diffusion plant and an electromagnetic separation plant. He once said, if that K-25 thing don't work, I'll be testifying for Congress for the rest of my life about a big white elephant we got down in East Tennessee. But it worked. This is the graphite reactor, what's now the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The reactor itself is in this building here, and that's what the front of it looks like. And the graphite reactor was built to prove that you can produce plutonium in a uranium reactor. Plutonium essentially doesn't exist in nature. But if you put uranium reactor into operation and you allow that to work, it will produce plutonium. The uranium-238 changes into plutonium-239. And they proved that you could produce that here in the graphite reactor. Sent just a small quantity of it out to Los Alamos. And then they built 3 large reactors up in Washington State at Hanford. And that's where the plutonium came from that was used in Fat Man and in the gadget that exploded at Trinity. Now, I know we're talking about the Manhattan Project, but Alan mentioned the fact that Oak Ridge transitioned after the war. And I want to quickly tell you that one man was responsible for the most of that. They were thinking about, as Alan said, thinking about whether they even needed to keep this place or not. But a man by the name of Pollard, who was a professor at UT, wanted to get the graphite reactor named a national laboratory. He and one other person, and I can't remember the other person's name, they left UT, took a leave of absence, and they started campaigning to get a national laboratory designated in Oak Ridge. Now, at this time, they were forming national laboratories in New York, Chicago, California, but not in the South. The political spectrum just was not supportive of what was needed to make a national laboratory in a fairly rural area in the South. So he got 14 southern universities to form a consortium and succeeded in the political difficulties required to get the Oak Ridge National Laboratory designated as a laboratory in March of 1948. So he went on to lead the Oak Ridge Associated Universities, started out as the Oak Ridge Institute for Nuclear Studies, and evolved into Oak Ridge Associated Universities. And I'll give him credit for making Oak Ridge able to stay here and for the laboratory becoming a national lab. Now, the individual that gets the credit for Y12 and the national security complex there is Jack Case. Jack Case was the director of the Y12 for the longest director we've had, or manager they call it. But in 1947, he was sent out to Los Alamos to bring back the technology for changing the powder that was being sent out there, the uranium powder, into metal. He brought that technology back, and they began to produce the metal, uranium metal parts for the bombs that were being built after the Manhattan Project, and continued even in 55 to 63. They produced the lithium-6 that was needed to make a hydrogen bomb. And that has continued to be Y-12's primary mission over these years, this technology of making uranium metal and producing bomb parts. The Oak Ridge graphite reactor, X-10 graphite reactor, also is where the first nuclear medicine was produced. Interestingly enough, the isotopes that were used to produce that nuclear medicine came from Y-12's calutrons, and I'm going to show you those in just a minute. But I want you to see this. This is the castle on the hill. This is the administration building where actually Colonel Nichols ran the entire Manhattan Project from right here in Oak Ridge. He had responsibility for Hanford, Washington. He had the administrative responsibility and facilities responsibility for Los Alamos. Oppenheimer had the scientist portion, but the rest of it was Nichols, and he ran Oak Ridge. He did the day-to-day activities. Groves was up in D.C. doing the political and making the decision. Colonel Nichols, that's the one criticism I have of Oppenheimer, the movie that Christopher Nolan made, a very good movie, but he did not portray Nichols appropriately. Nichols never had an office in Los Alamos. He went out there twice, March of 1943 and April of 45. He did have that conversation with Oppenheimer about his security clearance, told him he better be careful who he associated with. But that conversation happened in Chicago, not Los Alamos. But I can see Christopher Nolan saying, look, I got a one-sentence scene I need to make. Do I build a Chicago set, or do I just let that happen at Los Alamos? I would have done the same thing. Yes, please.
The castle on the hill, can you orient that to modern Oak Ridge?
I can. If you're, let me use this pointer. If you're looking now, this is the castle on the hill, and you're actually looking toward Jackson Square. So you're looking north. Those are the Cumberland Mountains. You're looking north to a little bit northwest. But that's Jackson Square, and those are the dormitories, all of the dormitories but one. Actually, it's not a dormitory, it's an apartment building. All the dormitories are gone. By the way, when Bill Wilcox came here in 1943, he looked at those 15 dormitories, and he and his buddy said, some of them have got M's on the front doors, and some of them have got W's. Well, they were smart enough to know that's men's and women's, so they counted them. There were 5 men's dormitory and 10 women's. They said that's pretty good odds. But that's the direction you're looking. You're looking north toward Jackson Square.
And where would the high school be now?
The high school is right here. Okay, that's the guest house. That's the chapel on the hill, and that's the high school. That's Blankenship Field, still being used today. The high school's gone. It's down on the turnpike. Thank you for that. Yes, ma'am.
So, is the castle on the hill still there today?
No, it's been torn down. It's the parking lot of the federal office building. The federal office building was built in the 70s, and they tore down the castle on the hill. Okay? Excellent. Thank you much. Yes, please.
Point out Big Ed's.
Right about there. Best New York style pizza you'll find anywhere. Maybe even in New York. Do you know Big Ed's Pizza started in Huntsville, Alabama? And there's still a Big Ed's Pizza in Huntsville, Alabama. He came to Oak Ridge in 1970 and became an institution, hiring all these high school kids. And then when he passed away, his son ran it. And after he passed away, his daughter-in-law now runs it. She has real plates and gets credit cards. He never would do that. He used paper plates and wouldn't take any credit cards. Any other question about the Manhattan Project? All right, let's move on. This is Happy Valley. It was about 15,000 people living just on the south side of Highway 58 across from K-25. It was the construction site. And it was torn down almost immediately after K-25 was built. So it's just a wooded area now. In 2006, the History Channel came to me and said, we want to make a movie about Oak Ridge. We want to call it The Lost City of the A-Bomb. Can you find us a lost city? I said, yeah, I can. So I let the mayor of the town go up through the woods and find an old fire hydrant. That was our lost city of the A-Bomb. That thing's still on History Channel now. It's got another name. But what I'm so proud of, I got 40 minutes out of an hour's program, and Los Alamos only got 20. So this is some of the streets in Oak Ridge. They talk about the mud. That is West Fonts Road off of Florida Avenue. By the way, Oak Ridge is laid out. The turnpike runs down in East Fork Valley. Outer Drive and West Outer Drive runs up on top of the ridge, Black Oak Ridge. If you want to get between either of those streets, you've got to find a street that has the name of a state. And almost always that will run between those. There are no, you don't make any circles or go around any blocks in Oak Ridge. If you want to go to a street that starts with an F, then you need to go to Florida. All of the streets on Florida are going to start with an L. So that's the way the city's laid out by Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill. Now, Jack mentioned earlier about Stone and Webster. Stone and Webster built the Y-12 plant, and they were given the assignment to build the city. They took General Groves a preliminary plan that was just laid out in blocks and just indiscriminate of the lay of the land. He looked at them and said, you don't know what you're looking at here. You don't have a clue. You can't build a city there like that. So he took it away from them and gave that contract to Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill. And they laid it out according to the lay of the land. Did a good job. Laid out about 7 areas that are, like Jackson Square is one of the main commercial areas. And then you've got the Grove Center, named for a grove of trees, not General Groves. And then you've got Jefferson Center, and you had Elm Grove, you had Cedar Hill, those kind of places where there were schools. And by the way, he hired Alden Blankenship and told him to build the best school system in the nation, pay the teachers the same salary they would get if they were in New York City. And he had 10 schools built in Oak Ridge in just a matter of months. But that area is laid out by Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill. A few years ago, we had an opportunity to preserve the guest house. And the way we had that, I'm on the Tennessee Historical Commission, and our state historical preservation officer told me, he said, Ray, if they can't use, DOE can't spend all the money they want to preserve K-25, which they couldn't. They'd let it go, and it had mold and mildew in it, and it was going to be very expensive to preserve that building. They can transfer that money and do something else. So we asked them, how about saving this Alexander Inn, which is what it was called then. McKee Alexander bought it and named it after himself. So it was in sad state of disrepair. It was falling down. DOE bought it from the person that owned it and stabilized it, gave it to the local historical group, and we gave it to Rick Dover for $1. Rick spent $8 million on it. He went to Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill's office. He got the plans for the guest house, and he made it back as close to the original as he could. And I'm really proud of that story. He did a good job with it. These are some of the flat top houses that are up near what's now the Children's Museum of Oak Ridge. It was the Highland View School at the time. Those flat tops are still there. Actually, about 85 to 90% of the houses in the east end of Oak Ridge around Jackson Square, and this is up at Highland View, they're all original homes. The Atomic Energy Commission transitioned the city of Oak Ridge from a government town to an incorporated city of Tennessee in 1959, and they sold the homes to those people living in them. Most of the homes now have either concrete, have brick, or have aluminum siding, but many of them are still original homes. They just look a little different. I have about 3 or 4 that I can show that are very close to originals. They brought in anything they could, trailers, anything, to make room for 75,000 people. Jack mentioned the buses running between Knoxville and Oak Ridge. There were actually 850 buses. 9th largest bus system in the nation was in Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project. I mentioned Lester Fox to you. Lester him and his brother saw an opportunity. They bought 100 buses and started a bus system. Now, Lester said those buses broke down every day. One day he had a wrecker. He was driving a wrecker. He had one of his buses on the back of that wrecker, and he saw another one broke down. He was over in Clinton. And when he saw it broke down, he just pulled that bus over right in front of the second one, tied a log chain between them, put him a driver in that second bus, and pulled it out on the road. Well, he hadn't gone very far till the policeman stopped him. Said, "Lester, you can't do that. Leave one of those buses and come back and get it. And besides, I want you to meet me in the courthouse at 8:30 on Monday morning." Well, now, Lester worried all weekend about what's going to happen to him when he went to the courthouse, but he went. When he got there, the policeman was already there. Said, "Lester, come with me." He took him down to an office there, and to the clerk's office, and said, "Give this boy a driver's license." Lester was 14 years old when he got his driver's license. He also had to come to Knoxville to get parts for these buses, and he came over here one day, and he couldn't find a place to park. He went all the way around the block, and he just wasn't an empty parking space. So he pulled his pickup truck up on the sidewalk right in the front door of the store. Got out and went in, got his parts, and came back out. And when he got out there was a policeman writing him a parking ticket. He said, No, you can't write me a ticket. I'm from Oak Ridge. We're trying to win the war over there." He tore the ticket up. So Lester left. When he came back the next day, he never looked for a parking spot. He run right up on that sidewalk. When he got out, that same policeman was there writing tickets. He waved at the policeman waved back. Lester never parked anywhere except right in the front door of that store from then on. That's the Jackson Square. Now that's looking in the other direction, okay? That's actually looking south. And those buildings that you see there, they're still there today. Big Ed's is off this picture. But all of the dormitories are gone. This apartment complex is still there. These are still there. The guest house is over here. That's what the guest house looked like in 1945. Now that's Y12, how Y12 looked in 1945. There are 9 large buildings, 1,152 calutrons. Calutron just stands for California University Cyclotron. Now, I want to back that out if I can. We're getting into that part that I want to do a little technology change. All right, let's do that. Now give me just a minute here and let's see if I can do this quick. If I can't, we'll move on. We're getting real close. It was the biggest secret in the biggest war in history. In the early 1940s, thousands of people from all over the United States poured into a quiet farming valley in East Tennessee. And 3 sites mysteriously named Y-12, X-10, and K-25 began work to end the deadliest global conflict in human history, World War II. For the Y-12 site, it all started right here in Building 9731, known at the time as the pilot facility. In March of 1943, the largest magnets in the world were installed here. They were used for a special separation effort to get an isotope that was really needed for the war effort. Calutron is what it was called. And this is the first of many installed here at Y-12. Now, just what is a calutron? Well, it's a mass spectrometer, basically a giant electromagnetic device for separating isotopes. Nobel Prize-winning physicist Ernest Lawrence invented the calutron in California. It's named after the electron magnet cyclotron at the University of California, Cal-U-tron. Here's how it works. A beam of uranium ions passes between the poles of a magnet, causing the ions to bend. They are split into different streams according to their mass, with the heavier ions making a larger arc, and the lighter ones making a slightly smaller arc. The small amount of the rare isotope uranium-235 was separated from the much larger amount of uranium-238 in natural uranium. The calutron worked at the laboratory level, but would it work for large-scale production? To find out, the calutrons here in Building 9731 began running in early 1943. They were used throughout the war to make improvements to the other calutron production units required to separate enough uranium-235 for Little Boy. Lawrence journeyed here many times to check on how well the calutrons were working. On one occasion, he was very helpful, but he caused quite a bit of consternation on the part of one of the scientists here.
We were running one night and very contentedly receiving uranium-235 into the collector pockets, and not a lot of sparking, not a lot of interruption. And E.O. Lawrence came in and he said, "Is this the best that will do?" And he sat down at the controls. And he started adjusting the voltages and adjusting the temperature of the oven to get more uranium out. And he increased that production tremendously. But at the same time, a lot of fireworks were going on inside the vacuum chamber. And in about 5 minutes, everything literally blew up inside the tank.
Lawrence's idea worked very well, even though it caused problems with its first attempt. The improvements were quickly implemented in the production calutrons. Working around the clock, they produced enough uranium-235 to supply the world's first atomic bomb ever used in warfare, Little Boy. It exploded over Hiroshima, Japan on August 6, 1945. Japan surrendered a few days later. With the end of World War II, Y-12's first mission was completed, but there were many more to come. The world's only alpha calutron magnets are on the right. They are still there in Building 9731. We're almost ready to allow the public access. I was able to provide tours during the Secret City Festival for a number of years, and was even able to take people into Beta 3 several years. I've done it 3 times, and we're hoping to eventually have it available for public access as well. These are the Calutrons that are still in there today. They operated until 1998, separating all of the elements into the isotopes, many of which were used to produce nuclear medicine.
In the early 40s, the world languished under the dark clouds of war. But at last, a ray of hope began to emerge as the United States mobilized to lead the Allies in the greatest war ever. Amid the relentless destruction of war, we also found ourselves in a high-stakes chess match involving strategy, logistics, and technology. To regain ground lost to German engineering, America began pouring massive energy and resources into machines and technology. And in shadowy locations across the U.S., mysterious work began on what could become the ultimate game changer. A small team of world-class physicists were joined by planners, then by chemists and engineers, then by thousands of craftsmen, women, and laborers, all led by one hard-charging general, and united in a cause that would not be denied. The Manhattan Project, probably the greatest technological endeavor of all time, had begun to take physical form at a secret location in Tennessee called Y-12. The first structure completed, Building 9731, would be the pilot facility for the entire Y-12 plant. Here, we would learn if Nobel Prize winner Ernest Lawrence's concept for separating uranium could work on an industrial scale. Only then might enough be obtained for an actual atomic weapon. The answer was yes. Once proven, the large electromagnetic devices known as calutrons now multiplied from a few prototypes in 9731 to more than 1,100 units in 9 large buildings. Some of the original electromagnets used in the pilot project remain on display today in Building 9731. At a feverish pace, an army of Y-12 workers fought their own secret war.
I want to show you a piece of the next one. So Beta 3 is one of the 9 large buildings that were used to house the Calutrons. The Calutrons were located in the high bay. So these are the Calutrons. Let me show you a little closer view. And notice the red line. That was to tell you if you had any metal in your pocket, you shouldn't get any closer than that because it might pull you right up against those large magnets. Remember, it's a batch process, so you've got one here, and the material goes into the bottom and comes out at the top. Now, it was one large racetrack of 36 Calutrons during the Manhattan Project when they were separating uranium. But then after the war, when they started separating those stable isotopes, they didn't need all of that large racetrack. They needed smaller ones. So they put in shunts here. So now they have 4 smaller racetracks that they can use to separate different elements in each of the racetracks. And they did that until 1998, separating all of the elements in the periodic table here at these Calutrons. The Calutrons were used during the war to separate the uranium for little boy. But after the war, they would separate all of the elements in the periodic table. Now this one is a little funny one I want you to see. All right, and I'm going to have just a minute or two for some more questions, and then we're going to wrap up. But I want you to see this one. Oh, I can't show it to you. All right. All you have to do is go to Explore Oak Ridge and look for the Calutron girl, Katie the Calutron girl. She's as cute as she can be, and she talks about Oak Ridge and does a good job of it. I want to talk about a spy just for a minute. Jack mentioned the one that was here in Knoxville. There was one in Oak Ridge. Actually, there were about 3 or 4, but this one's the most prominent one, George Koval. And notice that he was a U.S. citizen. He actually was born in Iowa. He went to Germany and went back to Russia as a teenager and got recruited by the KGB, and then was sent back to the States. Got into the Army as a special engineer detachment and came to Oak Ridge. And then after he died, he actually gave information to Russia about the calutrons and how difficult it was to separate that uranium. But notice here, Putin has recognized him with one of the highest, actually the highest civilian award that he can give in Russia, posthumously after he died. He was frustrated he didn't get very much recognition while he lived. There's a book that's been written about him by Anne Hagedorn called The Sleeper Agent. She came to Oak Ridge, I gave her a tour, and then she did an excellent job in researching this book. And it has a good account of George Koval. The spy that was out at Los Alamos, Klaus Fuchs, actually gave the plans to Fat Man to Stalin before we ever used it. So between George Koval telling him how hard it was to make the uranium, get the uranium, and Klaus Fuchs giving him the plans to Fat Man, that's why he reproduced Fat Man as their first bomb, a plutonium bomb, and didn't try to separate that uranium. If you want a good book about the Manhattan Project era in Oak Ridge, Denise Karenan's Girls of Atomic City is a good one I would recommend for you. Questions? Yes, please.
Okay. You couldn't show Katie the Calutron girl, but you had both images of Gladys Owens, I believe.
I did,
I didn't know if
yeah.
you had anything that you could say about Gladys.
Yes, Gladys Owens worked in Oak Ridge as a Calutron girl from January till August of 1945. Now, the reason she came down, she was up in Kentucky, and her best friend in high school got a job in Oak Ridge and wrote a letter and said, Gladys, you need to come to Oak Ridge and get a job. There's men down here. All the young men up in Kentucky were in the military. Gladys came down. She came back in 2004. She saw that famous picture of the Calutron girl. She's the one on the right, first one in the picture. And she said to Steve Stowe, who was the director of the museum at the time, that's me in that picture. Well, Steve called me right away and he said, Ray, I found you a Calutron girl. Now, that's where that phrase came from, folks. They weren't called Calutron girls back in the day. They were called cubicle operators. But because we started using that term and Denise wrote the book, everybody talks about them now as Calutron girls. She came with me. I took her back out to Y12, set her on a stool, made her picture. You saw it flash by when Beta 3 was up there. She came and helped me welcome 2,000 people into Beta 3 in 2005. A delicious lady, delightful lady. And she, after she'd been to Oak Ridge, I got a call from a television program, and they wanted to interview a Calutron girl. So I said, okay, I'll get you one. I called Gladys and I said, Gladys, there's a television program wanting to interview you. She said, oh, Ray, I don't get out much anymore. I said, can't you get somebody else? And I said, yeah, I can get somebody else. And we talked a minute more, and right before I hung up, she said, now, Ray, who did you say that television program was? And I said, it's Oliver North. She said, Ollie, I watch him every day. Can he come to my house? And I said, well, I don't know. I'll ask him. She said, I'll be interviewed if you'll let him do it. I called him back and I said, you can interview her, but there's only 2 conditions. One, you have to go to Kentucky to her house. And second, Oliver North has to do the interview. They agreed and came and did it. She called me after they left and said, Ray, you made my day. Ollie was here. Yes, sir.
We were recently in Oak Ridge and took the bus tour.
Okay.
I highly recommend that.
Yes.
But we were told that what you produced for the bomb was put in a briefcase.
Yes.
And a guy took it to Chicago on
Yeah.
a train and
Yeah.
then switched.
That's right. What happened is there were small gold-lined coffee cup-sized containers that uranium powder was put in there. 2 of them put in a briefcase, strapped to an Army lieutenant's arm, dressed him up to look like a salesman, put him on a passenger train here in Knoxville, went up to Chicago. When he got to Chicago, he handed that suitcase or briefcase off to 2 other officers who took it out to Los Alamos. Now remember, Groves believed in compartmentalization. He didn't want them to know where it was coming from, and he didn't want them to know where it was going. So he had them to drop it off in Chicago. But that's the way all of the uranium for Little Boy got transported, was in a briefcase. Yes, sir.
Well, briefly, when the Cayetron girls were sitting there working, what were they doing? What were they doing?
Interesting you would ask me that. Gladys asked me, she said, Ray, I never did know what I was doing. Can you show me? I said, yeah, I can show you, Gladys. So I opened up one of those cabinets. I said, Gladys, when you were adjusting those knobs, and that's what they did all day. They adjusted the knobs to keep a meter on a certain point. Let it drift to a control point, adjust the knob to bring it back. What that's doing is getting the most amount of the uranium-235 in the little containers up at the top. And they were reading the current off of it to get it maximized. And I said, when you were adjusting that knob, you were changing the value of a rheostat down here. She reached over and tapped me on the arm. She said, Ray, I still don't know what I was doing. But I know if I had any bobby pins in my hair, they'd just go and go stick to the wall somewhere. Largest magnets in the world at the time. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk again about what was the difference of output of uranium from K-25 versus Y-12? And you went over very well what happened to Y-12 after the war and what they continued to do. What did K-25 continue to do after the war?
That's an excellent question and another entire presentation. But no, quickly, the way that process worked at Y-12 was a batch process, 1,152 of them. K-25 is a continuous operation. You feed that gaseous material through 3,000 stages. And by the time it's done that, it will have enriched the 235 to up into the 90%. Now, what K-25 did was continue to do that. By December of 1946, it was capable, and it run continuously, and never shut down for 20 years. And it was capable of producing uranium that was 90+% uranium-235. All of the rest of the time, that K-25 building is where that highly enriched came from. Now, they built 4 more buildings at the K-25 location, 27, 29, 31, 33. They also built a gaseous diffusion plant at Portsmouth, Ohio, and at Paducah, Kentucky. All of those gaseous diffusion plants provided nuclear fuel for the nuclear power reactors in the nation, and some in Japan and others around the world, called toll enrichment. For a number of years, we were selling uranium to France and to other places that were building nuclear reactors. Now, eventually, they began their own production processes, and then we transitioned from gaseous diffusion to centrifuge, and that's what's being used today as a centrifuge. Does that help a little?
Yeah, but you said that the stuff for the bomb
Yeah.
from Y-12.
Came from Y-12 with just a little bit of input from S-50 and K-25. In March of 45, they began to feed it into the beta Cayutrons, the second stage at Y-12. shut down the alphas and use the betas. Yes, sir.
That was an excellent presentation.
Thank you. I'm
Given-
over time.
Given the more limited knowledge that they had about the effects of radiation in
Yes.
1944, 1945, how safe was it?
You can hold highly enriched uranium in your hand. It doesn't give off radiation, just a very little bit of alpha, and it'll be stopped by your skin or a piece of paper. Now, you don't want to eat it or inhale it. Any radiation inside your body is not good for you. Plutonium, on the other hand, is highly radioactive. You have to work on it in enclosed containers and without being in close contact with it. I don't know that there was any evidence of people working during the Manhattan Project that had any adverse effects of radiation. Now, there is a program by the Department of Labor that pays anyone in the nuclear weapons program that have certain types of cancer or certain types of other illnesses. They'll get their health paid for the rest of their life and get, I don't know how much it is now, $150,000 last time I checked. But if you look at all of the sickness associated with people working around nuclear weapons, what you'll find is there's a very, very small percentage that has to do with radiation. More of it that has to do with beryllium and has to do with some of the other materials that were being worked with that are carcinogenic, but not very much from radiation itself. Yes?
Do you know what exactly was it the USS Indianapolis took to?
Yes, I do. USS Indianapolis took the little boy uranium to the Tinian Island. And then after that, you know, it was sunk. Major catastrophe for those people. But they took little boy's uranium to Tinian Island. Yes, sir.
When World War III started, is North Korea going to be a major target?
Hey, do you remember when they got a false alarm that a nuclear missile was headed to Hawaii? You remember that? The television channel here in Knoxville called me and said, "Ray, we want to do an interview with you. What would you do if there was an announcement that there was a nuclear missile headed toward Oak Ridge?" I said, "Sure, come on over, I'll do it for you." They set up their camera, and the first thing they said was, "Okay, Ray, you know what we have had just happened in Hawaii. What would you do if you knew there was a nuclear missile headed toward Oak Ridge?" I said, "I'd just kiss this old world goodbye because I'm going to be vaporized in a few minutes." Needless to say, they didn't put that on television. Oak Ridge has been a target for Russia for all of the existence of Russian nuclear weapons. And let me tell you, if they drop one on Oak Ridge, Knoxville's gone too. Yes, sir.
A little humor for you. I went to the 8th grade when I was in Oak Ridge, and my dad worked at K-25. And he swore that the person that designed the city of Oak Ridge was on a 3-day drunk before he ever touched newspaper.
I don't have any comment to that. I got to quit. I'm running way over here.
How many pounds of uranium was in the little boy?
It's classified.
Pardon?
That's classified.
Oh, okay.
You can look it up on YouTube, on the internet. We sent out 60 kilograms, 140 pounds, less than a gallon. There was enough for little boy and a little left over, not enough for another bomb. Yes, sir.
What's the origin of the K-25?
I love it.
Names. What is the origin?
I got it.
It's not that.
When the person that was writing, George Robinson, writing the book, The Oak Ridge Story, he wrote it in 1950. He sent a letter to General Groves, and he said, "I need to know the origin of those codes, X10, Y12, K25, and S50. General Groves wrote him a letter back and said, "For the life of me, I cannot remember where we came up with those." But they don't have any meaning. Now, K25 might have a meaning. I'm not sure if we may have signed it later, but it might mean the K might stand for the Kellex company that made the gaseous diffusion equipment. The 25 is known to be a shortcut name for uranium-235. They took the 2 off the right-hand side of 92, the atomic number, and the 5 off the right-hand side of 235. They called it 25. Did the same thing with plutonium. Took the 4 off of 94 and the 9 off 239, called it 49. There's a guy who's written a book, Jeremy Bernstein, Plutonium, the World's Most Dangerous Material. On the front cover of his book, he has a watermark of a 4 and a 9. So he knows the story. I got one more if I can.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
How many people at Oak Ridge really knew what they were working on? And what was
About 100 of them, the scientists, the chemists would have known they were working on uranium. None of them would have known they were making a bomb. It had never been done before. It was the first time anything like this had ever happened. But they would have known. Now, Dr. Guggen came there as a chemist, and he knew the first day he was there that they were working with uranium. But he never even thought of a bomb. So they didn't know what they were doing.
Thank you.